Hi, in this video we're going to talk about lipids and proteins. Last time we were talking about macromolecules, and the two we talked about last time were carbohydrates and nucleic acids. So we're going to talk first about lipids. Some examples of lipids are fats, oils, and waxes. Lipids contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like carbohydrates do. And again, you can think of this as CHO. These are CHO are the symbols that you would use if you were writing the atoms, carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen. The difference between lipids and carbohydrates is lipids have many, many carbon and many, many hydrogen and very, very few oxygen. So there is not a nice, neat ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen like there is with carbohydrates. Lipids are not a polymer, therefore they are not made of monomers. So if you are asked what is the polymer and what are the monomers, you would say none. Lipids are not soluble in water. If you think about fats, oils, and waxes and about trying to put them in a glass of water and mix them, they don't mix very well, just like you can see on this background. It's a mixed, or it's oil and water being shaken. Lipids are made of two parts. They're made of glycerol, which is hydrophilic. So you can see this portion here is the hydrophilic head. Anything that is hydrophilic is polar. So hydro means water, philic means lover, and something that is polar would dissolve in water, so they would be hydrophilic. So polar and hydrophilic always go together. This is the head of the lipid. The other part of the fatty acid tails, that's these black parts that you see here. They're hydrophobic, and because they have a phobia or a fear of water. They don't dissolve in water because they are non-polar, and that's why when you try to mix lipids with water, they don't dissolve. Examples of lipids are, or the most famous example in biology, are phospholipids, and that's exactly what this picture is over here. This is a phospholipid. It's got a glycerol head and two fatty acid tails, and this is hundreds and thousands of these side by side make up a cell membrane. There's also triglycerides. Triglycerides, they're called tri because they have three of those tails instead of two, like phospholipids. Lipids, there are two kinds. Lipids contain two kinds of fatty acid tails. We have saturated fatty acid tails and we have unsaturated fatty acid tails. And you can see the difference between these two. This is where it would attach to the glycerol, and this is where it would attach to the glycerol. This fatty acid tail is made of a bunch of carbons, whole bunch of them, all single bonded to each other. Each of these lines represents a single bond. And on each of these carbons, you can see that there are 4 lines coming off of it because carbon is unique in that way. It makes 4 covalent bonds. So it's sharing electrons with this hydrogen, it's sharing electrons with this hydrogen, sharing electrons with this carbon, and sharing electrons with this carbon. Just a quick review of covalent bonds. So you can see that there are all single bonds between all of these carbons. So a saturated fatty acid tail would be a straight tail just like this. Whereas unsaturated fatty acid tails actually have a double bond between between 2 or more carbons. So this particular one happens to have 1 double bond. That's what those 2 lines are for, representing that these 2 carbons are sharing 4 electrons instead of just 2 in a single bond. So there can be multiple locations where we've got this double bond going on, and that would qualify as unsaturated because it's not got as many hydrogens as you can possibly get. You can see that this carbon does not have a second hydrogen here, and this carbon does not have a second hydrogen here. So the function of lipids, there's lots of functions for lipids. We're going to talk about 3 specific ones. They are great for long-term energy storage. They're great for insulation and protection. They're also a major component of membranes. So as you can see in this picture here, we've got a whole bunch of phospholipids all lined up side by side, and here as well. And you can see they go back this way, and they would go on and on and on back into these spaces. What they do is, this is part of a cell membrane, and this is called a phospholipid bilayer because it's 2 layers of phospholipids with the hydrophobic tails pointed toward each other. So you can see this part out here is where you would be outside of the cell. This is where you would be inside of the cell. And we could actually draw this continuing all the way around. So a cell, like a balloon, when we're talking about this, the actual rubber of the balloon or the latex of the balloon would be made up of this phospholipid bilayer if it were a cell. Proteins. Proteins are wonderful. They are the structure of your hair, your fingernails, your muscle. So one of the functions of protein is structure. Another is they regulate chemical reactions. They actually can speed up chemical reactions, and the particular protein that we're talking about here is an enzyme. And in the next topic, we'll spend lots of time talking about enzymes. Proteins also are involved in chemical signaling. When I was talking about on the previous slide, talking about the phospholipid bilayer, well, on that bilayer of phospholipids, sometimes there's proteins that go all the way through that membrane. They stick out the outside of the cell and they stick out the inside of the cell. Those are called transmembrane proteins because they go across the membrane. They go from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. They stretch across that membrane. We also have what are called surface proteins on the cell membrane, where they are either on the outer surface of the cell membrane or they're on the inner surface of the cell membrane. So proteins have 3 functions that we're talking about: structure, regulating chemical reactions, and cell signaling. Proteins contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, as well as phosphorus, and you can think of proteins as being CHON-P. Now, I like giving you guys stupid associations, ways to remember. The word protein starts with the letter P, therefore there is phosphorus in this one as well. It ends with the letter N, so there must be nitrogen in this one as well. And all of our macromolecules have CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So that will help you remember that proteins also contain nitrogen and phosphorus. You can see here we've got a monomer of a, we have a monomer of a protein. The polymer of a protein is a polypeptide. The monomer of a protein is an amino acid. Amino acids are made of several parts. They're composed of an amine group, that's this part over here. They're composed of a carboxyl group, that's this part in purple over here. And they're also composed of an R group. The R group is what varies from amino acid to amino acid. That's what makes each amino acid different from each other. All of these parts are all attached to a central carbon, and the 4th bond of the central carbon is a hydrogen. Now, as it says over here, you don't have to memorize where all the atoms are in this amino acid, but what you do need to know is on one side is an amine group. An opposite of the amine group is a carboxyl group. And then on one of the other sides is an R group opposite a hydrogen. So you just need to remember these words. You do not need to remember that an amine group is nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. You don't need that kind of detail. So that's what you need to know about proteins and lipids. If you have any questions, let me know in class.